By 1996, grunge was squarely on its last legs, with the scene winding down and new releases coming out without much fanfare. Electronic music, on the other hand, was thriving, with the period's cutting-edge sounds spawning out of places like Bristol's trip-hop clubs and the underground raves across Europe. So what's a good old rock band to do? Well, you could double down on the distortion and heavy riffs, or you can trade in the Marshall stack for a synth and a drum machine. These are some of the notable times established rock bands decided to go the electronic route back in the 90s. U2, Pop, 1997. After the industrial light experimentation of Achtung Baby, U2 went heavier on the club music with their next album. Recording Pop was a notoriously messy process where the band tried to marry their stadium-sized anthems to techno, trip-hop, and loops. The lead single, Discotheque, is an energetic departure from their familiar sound that embraces pop excess, while tracks like Mofo showcased a frantic, electronic pulse that sounded more like a rave in a Dublin warehouse than a rock record. It's a stark contrast to the more earnest sound that made the group popular in the 80s. While the album sold well enough, it was a commercial disappointment by U2 standards. At risk of losing their biggest band in the world status, they retreated to the safe, meat-and-potatoes rock of All That You Can't Leave Behind for their next release, and basically never touched a synthesizer again. The Smashing Pumpkins, Adore, 1998. When Billy Corgan fired drummer Jimmy Chamberlain, the heavier half of the Pumpkins' DNA vanished. In its place, Corgan embraced a gothic, electronic minimalism. Lead single, Ava Adore, used a grinding, mechanical loop that felt cold and menacing, while Appels plus Oranges, or whatever that's called, sounded like something straight out of an 80s synth-pop nightmare. Swapping the big muff distortion for drum machines and dark ambient textures, the entire album was a brave departure that ultimately alienated many of the fans they gained through Melancholy, though it did find a cult following among fans who appreciated the vulnerability. Sales-wise, the album flopped compared to their last record, and a frustrated Corgan eventually brought Jimmy back for the distorted Machina. However, Adore has since been reevaluated as a misunderstood masterpiece, proving Billy was just a few years ahead of the indie electro curve. Before we continue, you can enjoy more 90s music discussions by subscribing to the channel and smashing that like button. We plan to make more of these, so keep up with us and let's embrace the nostalgia together. REM, Up, 1998. When they lost founding drummer Bill Berry, REM switched from being a college rock band to a sort of rock art ensemble. Up, their first album without him, is defined by space and vintage circuitry. Lotus featured a fuzzy electronic strut, while Day Sleeper used subtle loops to create a sense of jet-lagged isolation. The standout Hope is essentially a high-speed, mechanical pulse that Michael Stipe sings over in a stream of consciousness blur. It is a lonely, beautiful, and sterile record that feels like walking through a neon-lit but empty city in the wee hours of the morning. The album marked the beginning of the end for their chart dominance. While the critics respected the shift into art rock, the general public didn't respond quite as positively. REM spent the rest of their career trying to find a balance between this new digital moodiness and the jangly sound of their college rock days to mixed results. Bush, The Science of Things, 1999. After 1997's Deconstructed, where different EDM producers remixed a bunch of the band's previous songs, Bush decided to dive headlong into electronica for their third studio album, which came dripping in trip-hop textures and electronic glitch. The Chemicals Between Us used a prominent synth hook and programmed drums to bridge the gap between grunge and the dance floor, while War Machine toyed with industrial light aesthetics. It was a polished, expensive-sounding record that put to rest the band's old sound, replaced by a more cinematic, electronic angst. Sadly, it didn't work. While the lead single was a hit, the album couldn't match the multi-platinum successes found by their earlier work. Many of their fans were stuck wanting the same loud and fuzzy Bush from their two previous studio releases, while many electronica fans found it rather unimaginative. Simply put, it was a bust on all fronts, prompting the band to go on a long hiatus shortly after release. Marilyn Manson, Mechanical Animals, 1998. After the gritty, industrial filth of Antichrist Superstar, Manson underwent a Ziggy Stardust makeover. This album is a lush, chrome-plated tribute to 70s glam, but it's underpinned by a cold, 90s electronic sheen. The Dope Show featured a strutting, synth-driven beat that felt like a processed version of 70s glam rock band T-Rex, while Posthuman utilized heavy digital manipulation to emphasize the album's themes of hollow celebrity. It was the sound of a monster becoming a pop star, trading in the muck of the previous album for a cleaner, more calculated kind of chaos. The album went to the top of the charts and proved Manson had actual pop sensibilities, although it came at the expense of losing some of his scary reputation. He eventually pivoted back to a heavier, more theatrical sound with Hollywood, but the shiny electronic influence remained in his productions for years. Blur, 13, 1999. Following a brutal breakup and a desire to distance themselves from Parklife Britpop, Blur hired William Orbit, coming fresh off his work with Madonna, to produce 13. The result was an album that sounded like it was being pulled apart by a computer virus. Bugman is a distorted, mechanical nightmare, while BLUREMI is a frantic punk techno hybrid. Even the beautiful Tender is surrounded by experimental bleeps and bloops. It was the sound of a band literally breaking their songs to see what kinds of sonic wonders it can produce in the process. It was the beginning of the end for the original lineup, as guitarist Graham Coxon struggled with the new direction. However, this electronic experimentation laid the groundwork for Damon Albarn's massive success with Gorillaz, which would dominate in the next decade. Motley Crue, Generation Swine, 1997. As if it wasn't enough to kill hair metal in the 90s, one of the stalwarts of the genre had to go ahead and try to sound like an industrial band too. That's exactly what happened with Motley Crue's album from 1997, which pivoted the group towards a gritty, electronic-infused sound with lo-fi production, tinny industrial drums, and weird vocal processing. Tracks like Afraid and Generation Swine are drowning in distorted vocals and fuzzy programming, along with an overall production style that seemed like a mix between Nine Inch Nails and the Pixies. It was a total train wreck, with many fans considering it their identity crisis album. Much of the music came across as muddy electronic mess, and it's one of those things that left everyone baffled. It remains arguably the weirdest footnote in their career, that one moment the bad boys of the 80s tried to become the digital outcasts of the 90s and failed spectacularly. The Cure, Wild Mood Swings, 1996. While Robert Smith was no stranger to synthesizers, this album saw him attempting to play with the brighter, more eclectic electronic sounds of the mid-90s. Granted, the rhythmic loops and electronic textures were mostly subtle, with the album really being more of an experiment in jazz and jangle pop. But the electronic elements do pop up consistently in many of the tracks. The 13th is a bizarre mix of mariachi horns and electronic rhythms that left many fans scratching their heads. Meanwhile, Gone flirted with a jazzy trip-hop vibe. The album is famously inconsistent, but it represents the moment where the long-running kings of goth tried to step out of the shadows and see if they could thrive in the colorful, digital landscape of the Cool Britannia era. It is widely considered one of their worst albums by both fans and critics alike. It was such a profound misstep that Robert Smith corrected course immediately, returning to the sprawling, gloomy, atmospheric rock of Bloodflowers to restore the band's legacy. Beastie Boys, Hello Nasty, 1998. The Beasties have always been genre fluid, having gained a well-earned reputation of never making the same album twice. Hello Nasty, however, is arguably their most complete album, combining the sample-heavy complexity of their earlier work, complete with Mixmaster Mike on board, with futuristic electronic textures. Intergalactic is the definitive track here, a vocoder-heavy, robotic anthem that felt like it was beamed in from a 22nd century b-boy battle. Body Movin' and the Negotiation Limerick File saw them blending their hardcore punk roots with high-tech sampling and scratching, creating a sound that was both retro and light years ahead. The album turned out a massive critical and commercial smash that won 2 Grammys, further cementing the Beastie Boys' place as one of the most eclectic musical groups of the era. Garbage, version 2.0, 1998. Producer Butch Vig decided to see how far he could push digital editing on this record. Every snare hit and vocal line on version 2.0 was sliced, diced, and processed to perfection. Push It famously sampled the Beach Boys, but layered it under a wall of industrial synths and trip-hop beats, while I Think I'm Paranoid felt like a rock song that had been reassembled by an AI. It is the quintessential cyber rock album, shiny, dangerous, and meticulously engineered for the end of the millennium. The record represented the peak of Garbage's career, earning them multiple Grammy nominations and selling millions. However, the record was so perfect and overproduced that the band struggled to find a new direction on subsequent albums, as they seemed to have already reached the logical conclusion of that sound. The Boo Radleys, Come On Kids, 1996. For many bands, adding EDM elements meant making your music more accessible to what's popping among the young music fans of the day. That's not the case here. The Radleys were coming fresh off the massive success of Wake Up Boo, with a legion of new fans behind them. Instead of making another Britpop album that sounded like the last one, though, they decided to make an entirely different record, layered with an abrasive mess of distorted electronics, feedback, and avant-garde noise, with much of the group's signature sweet harmonies replaced by loops and digital grit. The result is a critical darling that inspired the direction of many bands, including Radiohead, in the latter part of the 90s. However, it scared off a lot of their newer fans, while prompting many radio stations to avoid the record entirely. It was a brave, experimental masterpiece that didn't work out commercially, but cemented Boo Radley's place in the heart of many dedicated music fans. Ned's Atomic Dustbin, Brain Blood Volume, 1995. Ned's Atomic Dustbin built a reputation for dense, energetic, and rhythmic thrashy pop that's punctuated by a two-bass sound, with one bass playing traditional bass lines and the other providing a thick sonic wall that really set their music apart. For their third album, however, the two-bass attack became less prominent, with the band opting to lean into the heavier use of keyboards, samplers, and synthesizers. Instead of the frantic, punk-addled anthems of their previous albums, the tracks featured looping grooves and a much more atmospheric production style, with modern dance rhythms. The album itself was pretty good, but it was a jarring shift for fans, and the sales numbers proved it. While their first two albums charted highly in the UK, the third one didn't even enter the charts, leading to the band breaking up shortly after its release.